I don't believe that Trump's tariffs will do what he's saying they will accomplish.
I think we can bring these entire industries back, that we can assemble things in America component by component.
It's a complicated question because you certainly will get some jobs back. That's a separate question from whether or not these tariffs are actually going to accomplish that.
AI is not going to be able to fill everything.
Welcome to Our National Conversation, a podcast in which we discuss politics from all angles. We are completely nonpartisan, and all views, respectfully stated, are welcome here. Our podcast is unique in that it is hosted and run by students who are focused on finding solutions to the biggest problems facing America.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Our National Conversation. Today, we are going to be talking about the tariffs. Now, we've talked about tariffs on this podcast in the past, but our discussion was somewhat limited. It was just me and Eric at the time. The tariffs weren't nearly as extensive as they are now. And today we are also joined, in addition to Eric, who's spoken with me on this topic in the past, we are joined by Connor, who might have, as far as I understand it, a more robust, supportive opinion of the tariffs to complement maybe Eric's nuanced view and my heavy skepticism of the tariffs themselves and their effectiveness. Though, of course, we have to acknowledge we're operating in a lot of ignorance here as to what the long-term effects will be. So, we're just going to kind of talk about this, talk about our thoughts on the subject, and really try to understand one another's perspectives, what's informing those perspectives, and whether there's common ground here. So I say we just kind of jump into things. In case you don't know, and this is your first podcast with ONC, my name is Sam Taylor. I am the Chief Operating Officer at Our National Conversation, the nonprofit associated with this podcast. Connor is the Director of Policy Content and Strategy, and Eric is one of our policy writers. Both, for the most part, are self-described conservatives, and though I will be, always trying to play devil's advocate in these podcasts, I maybe tend to lean more towards a progressive view, especially on a lot of the Trump administration's policies. So we'll see where we end up today. Let's actually start, I think, with Connor. Because you weren't in the last tariffs podcast, I want to kind of get an idea of what your view of the tariffs are that the Trump administration is implementing, whether you are supportive of these policies, and what's informing your view on the subject.
Well, I really can't come out with anything other than support for these tariffs. I think a lot of Americans don't really understand the nuance that's involved, and that's okay because, well, macroeconomics is it's definitely not the easiest thing to take a stab at. And I think a lot of people just judge judge the state of the country, the state of the union, based off of how much they're paying for milk at the grocery store, or how much it's costing them for a few drinks on a night out with some buddies, etc. Consumer culture and consumer goods. So uh, I I really think that essentially what we're looking at here is in regards to tariffs is short-term pain, long-term gain. And by short-term, I'm not I'm not exactly an economist, so it's hard to say. I imagine that this could mean a few years of of a tough spot for America, where if we're going to reindustrialize, which I think is incredibly important to the integrity, maintaining the integrity of the middle class in this country, which has been sold out by internationalists and globalist policies since the 1990s. And I think, if we're going to reshore a lot of our, not just near shore, but if we're going to reshore a lot of critical domestic manufacturing industries in this country, that's not something, it's not a light switch that can be flipped on overnight. It's going to take some time. I'm not sure how much time, but it's going to take some time to bring all that back, to bring American manufacturing back online, to bring these Rust Belt states back to life. We're talking about millions and millions of Americans and their jobs, which were sold out, which were basically handed to foreigners overseas. And our government told them in the 90s that it's going to be okay and that we're going to retrain you and there's going to be social safety nets, etc., for you guys to transfer into another sector. You're going to make the same salary you're making before. It's not true. People have been disenfranchised. Tens of millions of Americans have lost their jobs. They're now earning what I think about 30%. They took basically like a 30% permanent pay cut, and that's remained in place for decades. Mind you, real wages haven't risen since the 1970s, and we've been running a trade deficit. We haven't ran a trade surplus in this country since 1975, and there's real implications to that. So we essentially it's been exactly 50 years now since 1975. So we've been digging ourselves into this hole for 50 years now with the idea that massive trade deficits are just an abstraction and don't really have any meaningful impact on a country or its people, um, is ridiculous. I think that uh, the American people have been essentially lied to. Jay Powell will come out and give his speech at Jackson Hole and say things like, "Oh, the American economy has never been stronger." All these internationalist elites who are the primary beneficiaries of transferring to a service-based economy, which in reality Americans have figured out 30 years later has just been a bunch of financial trickery. It's about shifting capital around in markets. Very few people benefit from this. They're not actually adding any real value to the economy. They're not creating any products. Um, they're charging interests on loans. They're shifting your capital around from this hedge fund to that hedge fund, and they're making a profit on that. As where we used to produce real goods, cars, textiles, etc., things that actually had physical value. And so, um, yeah, I guess in a nutshell, these tariffs are the way of really correcting an imbalance. And I like to think of them as reciprocal tariffs. People say, well, we weren't in a trade war before. Yeah, but we've been we've been locked into this asymmetry going on for 50 years now, where other countries charge us. They place massive taxes on anything that we export, and that's why we don't export anything. And you know what that's called? It's called a tariff. So we're just putting the same practices into place that other countries have had in place in regards to us for well over 50 years now. And it's only right. It's protecting domestic manufacturing. Yes, it's going to cause short-term price hikes for sure. It's going to add onto the inflationary pressures, but I think that a weaker dollar is in the best interest of the American people right now. I think we just have to suck it up and just understand that, I think 10, 15 years down the road, if these tariffs stay in place, and that's the thing that we'll probably get to, is that for any of this to work, for us to see the fruits of this later on and appreciate the long-term gains, these tariffs have to stay in place. If they just stay in place for the next 4 years, and then so the next administration, roots them out, then it's just a lose-lose. Then the American people are going to go through all this hardship, increased consumer prices, etc., and we're not going to get anything in return out of it because it's going to take a while for America to reindustrialize and to come back to its full potential.
Thank you for explaining that, Connor, and for really thoroughly representing a perspective that I think is underrepresented in a lot of the media. Because I haven't really heard this sort of justification for the tariffs presented in such a thorough manner, just based on what I've read. So I really do appreciate that. I have some points that I'd like to um, maybe put some pressure on to kind of see if there's more research you have on the subject, what your reaction would be. But before I do that, let's turn to Eric. Is there anything you want to add onto what Connor has said? Anything you want to note that you agree with and want to build off of, or anything you want to disagree with or add nuance to?
Sure. So I think Connor's hitting at a really politically salient point, which is in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there's no doubt that our political leaders sold out our manufacturing base to other countries. But what I think Connor may be missing from his explanation is automation. One of the biggest drivers of that change has been automation as well as globalization. You can find differing reports based on the percentages of those two things. Um, but I think, especially with these tariffs, it's a little bit of a fallacy to believe that they're going to reshore these kind of, these image that we have in our head of these 7 to 80s, factory steel workers. First of all, steel, aluminum, and semiconductors are all exempt from these tariffs. So if we were trying to reshore these for national security purposes, that's not happening. Um, and so I would like to believe that, if the tariffs were to stay in place, I think we would see some, reshoring happening. But I think the most of these factories that would be built prospectively would be almost completely automated. So I don't think that's a real, it may sound nice, but I don't think that would really bring the boom back to the American middle class. Sadly, I think those days are behind us. And, Connor's comments about a service economy, those are true, but I think the solution to that is hyper education and leaning into the AI boom, not away from it. And not that's that was if we go back 20 years ago, Democrats were the one calling for tariffs and protectionism and protecting the working class, and Republicans were kind of the free traders, globalists. Let's get this technology in, let's get these low wage jobs back to robots or to robots. Um, and I think there's a mix of this. I think some protectionism is fine, but I think avoiding those things with tariffs, which by the way also make the sectors that you target tariffs with make them less competitive. I mean, this happened with the car industry in the 70s. In the 1950s, America was the dominant car country in the world, and in 70s and we slapped tariffs on them in the 60s. Um, and by the time we pulled those tariffs back in the 70s, we got crushed by Japan because Japan had been competing in the global marketplace and we had protected our own industries and they got fat and happy. And that happens with tariffs. So I think it's a politically viable point, but I don't think in reality it will do that much to reshore American jobs or protect our national security interests.
Mm. Connor, what's your reaction to Eric's points there?
I do think that tariffs are in our national security interests. I mean, this is something that even the Biden administration stated when they put protections in place on key industries. Um, uh, Semiconductors. I mean, we're already building massive factories in Arizona, and mind you, you know, yeah, they're these sorts of industries are exempt from tariffs right now because, well, we don't have the capacity, we don't have the domestic capacity to produce semiconductors at the moment, and we won't for some time. We're talking about the world's this is semiconductors. Modern semiconductors produced by TSMC, the Taiwan Semiconductor Corporation, are we're talking about the cutting edge of technology in today's world, and they've been specializing in that for decades. So it's I mean, don't get me wrong, the U.S. is at the forefront of technological cunning, but it's going to take a number of years to bring these massive, highly specialized factories online, and I think we will. It's these are already being built in places like Arizona and other areas of the country. They're going to employ a lot of people, and this is the sort of stuff that we can't afford to outsource. Um, I think I do agree that the global economy today is not what it was in William McKinley's time. I know that Trump likes to champion William McKinley. Back then, tariffs were okay because, um, global. Well, it's exactly that. It's global manufacturing today, as where back then it was local. American industries could stand completely on their own in the absence of tariffs, as where, when you receive a bicycle or a car, we don't necessarily produce uh, everything that's involved in creating a car. Semiconductors are a great uh, example of that. So, if we want to bring those things back, then and yeah, you're right. Automation, that's a very important point, actually, Eric, is that automation has been responsible for a portion of the disenfranchisement that's happened since the 1990s, most definitely. But I still think that, look at China, for instance. China is a highly advanced economy now. Some would people economists argue all the time whether China's economy is more advanced than ours. They're neck and neck. A lot of people think that if they haven't already overtaken us, they're going to within the next couple of years here. Um, and China's also at the cutting edge of automation and things like this, and yet they employ uh, a mind-boggling amount of people in manufacturing. China's the world's factory, um, and so forth. So yeah, I think that leaning into the AI boom is important, and it's people say, oh well, AI is going to take jobs away. Yeah, I do think that AI is going to fill some services, most definitely, but also it's going to open up doors to innovation, and that means opening up doors to new industries that we had never considered before, that AI now makes possible. And it opens the door for that, also opens the door for more humans to come in and be involved in that. And likewise, it I think it's going to mean breakthroughs in a lot of sectors and key industries all over the place, and that also opens up more room. You're expanding the parameters of that sector. AI is not going to be able to fill everything. There's always going to be a need for human intervention and oversight, and so I do agree with that. But um, no, I think that a lot of this stuff can come back. There's no reason why it shouldn't, and yeah, the world's a different place now than it was, 30 years ago, 40 years ago. But I still believe that, a lot of Americans have been left behind. Um, and I'm not sure if, hyper education, uh, maybe you can elaborate on this, Eric, but I mean, Americans have never been more college educated than they are now. But I don't think that this is something that's done them a favor, really. I think we see that with, the Gen Z memes of, of pointing fingers at the job market and saying that, this is like we always joke about this being like a depression job market because there are countless, 20 something year olds freshly graduated who have had degrees for a few years now or whatever, and they all joke that they've applied to 1,000 jobs and haven't received a single interview. I know a person who's in her late 20s, and she applied to over 600 jobs over the last 18 months and
Wow.
only got an interview from one of them. So something's awry here.
Yeah, so I kind of want to focus in on a particular issue both of you were addressing a little more. And obviously, we've noted this before. None of us here are expert economists. We're not here to offer like after thorough analysis and study, here's what we've concluded on the effects of tariffs. But I do think that the interesting point we want to hit on in this podcast is if I might, apply this label and feel free to reject it if you want, but I've heard you describe yourselves as this in the past. We have two conservatives who basically have maybe overlapping in some respects, but in many respects divergent views on the tariffs and their effect. And we keep talking about how the effects of tariffs might allow in the long term for the return of substantial manufacturing, and that might be in the uh, interest of the US's security apparatus and so forth, our rivalry with China, etc. And I'm seeing just very divergent views on whether automation will have, basically prevent us from accruing any of those benefits, or whether it won't really have much of a, present much of an obstacle there. I just want to better understand what's informing these divergent views here. Connor, why do you believe that automation isn't going to prevent us from bringing back a lot of these industry jobs? You mentioned kind of the China example and how they seem to be bringing together both of these spheres, allowing for substantial employment in manufacturing while still being on the cutting edge of technological advancement. Um, Eric, I kind of want to know what your reaction is to that, whether you think that's kind of a justified point here, kind of the China-US comparison, whether there's anything else you would like to say about whether the tariffs in question are in the United States' security interest. And then Connor, I kind of want to return back and just dig in more, like I, I suppose, like, what's really informing this perspective that you're bringing to the table? Why do you believe this? Because for me personally, looking at all this information, I just don't know what to believe. I don't feel that I have the expertise, or I've done the research necessary to have a thorough opinion on this. So I just kind of want to know what exactly we're drawing from here, if that makes sense. I apologize. That was a lot of different questions, and I was kind of forming that as I was speaking, but let's return to kind of a simple initial question here now that we've kind of got the trajectory set. Eric, what is your reaction to Connor's point that China is already blurring the lines between heavy manufacturing employment and high technological advancement? And is there anything else you would like to bring to the table that might defend your original perspective here?
Sure. I think one word could answer it: wages. China can get away with paying their people a lot less than we will ever be able to do. I'm no fan of labor unions in this country, but they certainly serve a purpose. And one of those purposes is to keep wages inflated for the American worker. Yes, China does make a lot of products, and they are on the cutting edge of a lot of those things. And I think they kind of blend really low wage, unskilled jobs with high levels of automation. Now, I don't think that's something that we'd be willing to do here back in the States. I think there would be a lot less humans on site, making a lot more with a lot more automation. Now, look, I don't want to say this like I don't think we shouldn't bring, these factories back. I'm all for reshoring these factories with the automation. But I think the argument that this is going to cause, a massive boon to the middle class with these jobs coming back, I don't think that's true. I think it would help the overall economy, and I think there are certain sectors that we certainly need to protect for national security interests. But I think it's a complicated question because you certainly will get some jobs back. But that's a separate question from whether or not these tariffs are actually going to accomplish that. If we could reshore all these things with all the automation, I'd be totally for that. But like I said, that's a separate question from whether or not Donald Trump's, April 2nd tariffs will do that. So yeah, that's kind of where I stand.
So to kind of just make sure I understand your perspective appropriately here, Eric, you agree with Connor that for the most part, these tariffs are probably a good idea in the long term, right? That if we can bring back manufacturing to the United States in a lot of these crucial sectors, that would be fantastic. But we shouldn't expect an employment boom or a return to a fully stacked and booming Rust Belt, or something like that. That we should envision a more automated manufacturing base that we're kind of returning to the United States ideally. Of course, we'll have to see exactly what the precise effects of the tariffs will be, and that we should lean into that by really leaning into AI education. That focuses on that, and so forth. Is that the perspective you're offering?
Kind of. So I do like the idea of reshoring those things, but I'm not a fan of the Trump tariffs. And one of the
Mm,
other reasons, the main reason actually for that, is because I think this is going to push our allies in the East right into China's hands. I think if we tariff the heck out of these, Southeastern Asian countries, and other countries that are already closer to China on the map, we're going to cut off trade from them. China is right there, ready to swoop in and take those dollars, replace the yen with the dollar wherever they can. And I think that will happen. Now, if this is a negotiating tactic, like I hope it is, then those tariffs never see the light of day. I saw this morning that Taiwan is willing to do 0% trade, Israel willing to do 0% tariff rate. So that's my main reason. I think you could ideally construct a tariff package that could reshore some of these things, but I think tariffs would be one in a multitude of steps in a given plan to reshore these jobs and in these factories. So overall, a no on Trump's tariffs, but a yes to reshoring, some of the factories and jobs.
mm. Yeah, Connor, I'm curious as to what your reaction to that particular point is, that, because these tariffs might put pressure on a lot of our alliances, it might jeopardize the United States' geostrategic situation and allow China to expand its influence. What's your reaction to a point like that?
I am concerned about China. I don't really view Europe as our allies, to be honest. I'm very much part of this newer wave of I don't know, outcast conservatives who I just don't think it's in our best interest. Well, I mean, if you when it comes to like an economic standpoint, sure, like if you want like a market to export to, then I guess it is important to some degree that we have a Europe that we can do business with just for business sake. But as far as investing and sending billions to Europeans who should really be fronting the bill for their own security, they're certainly wealthy enough to do it, and the same goes for Israel. I am concerned about China, and yeah, totally. I think that Eric makes a good point. A lot of these tariffs kind of function as bargaining chips, and that very well could be the case. He's offering them, reductions in tariffs. Say, well, there's tariffs in place as of right now, but we're willing to reduce those significantly if you cooperate in our interests. And I think that's a great strategy. Um, but yeah, I think sure, if we tariff our allies in East Asia, which I think if you want to argue in favor of like a sort of Cold War era containment strategy for China, then you know certainly these are policies that could, if they were to see the light of day, like Eric said, it could push them. I don't think it's going to push them into China's hands, because I I think that Japan and South Korea and the Philippines, they're already incredibly weary of China. I think that, well, I think they just had a meeting the other day. It was the first time that one of the countries had spoken to China in quite some time, and in light of the announcement on tariffs by the United States. And so I think that while they remain open to certain amounts of pragmatic, I would call it pragmatic cooperation with China, I don't think that they would be, they're certainly not uh, aligning themselves ideologically or politically with China. Now the question remains, well, China's a much larger country, it's more powerful, etc. So, China does always have the option of kind of strong arming its neighbors. Um, I don't necessarily think it's in a position to do that right now, just because of the U.S. military presence in the area in Japan and South Korea, etc. I think if it took Taiwan, then it can break the first island chain there, which is important in Chinese or American policy on the containment of China. But until that happens, really, I think that I don't know. China's facing a lot of domestic problems. They're facing demographic collapse. These are consequences of the one-child policy in decades past. So I think China is essentially at the peak of its power right now, and I think from here it's only gonna its influence is only going to decline. I still think it's going to be a great power in the 21st century, but it has a very limited time frame and window that it needs to work within in order to achieve its wider, geopolitical goals in the reason, sorry, in the area. And the U.S. should be weary of that. But uh, yeah, that's kind of where I stand on China. It's something that we should pay attention to.
And if I could follow that up with an additional question for Connor, because in these comments we make a lot of different points, and I want to make sure that as best as possible we're not kind of jumping over anything that I think would make for something interesting to really dig into here. That's returning to this question of whether China represents a model or an example of how the United States can blend manufacturing with substantial technological innovation and advancement. So Connor, you had said that this kind of I guess demonstrates that such a balance is possible. But Eric made the point that the Chinese method of doing this, using really, really low wages for a lot of low skilled manufacturing jobs, just isn't politically or economically feasible in the United States. That it's not something that Americans are going to take to. So we should lean more into the automation and kind of technological side of things and really try to leverage any advantages we might incur there. What's your reaction to something like that? And as an additional kind of supplementary question here, you kind of keep returning to this point that no, I do think that we can bring manufacturing back to the United States in a way that benefits individual workers and their families. What's really informing that perspective? Why is that something that you believe very strongly?
Well, I think that no, I think Eric makes a good point that yes, this is one thing that that critics like to point to is that the cost of U.S. labor is far higher than what it is in Vietnam or Bangladesh or places like China. Um, but I still believe that we can bring we can bring some of these jobs. I think we can bring these entire industries back, that we can assemble things in America component by component. We can assemble an entire car made in America. I don't see any reason that we can't do that. I think Eric's right. It's going to bring back some jobs, not all of them. We're not going to see all the jobs, the same amount of jobs that we saw in 1990 or 1980, etc. Just because, well, the growth of technology is inevitable, and automation is inevitable. It's going to continue. But I think that opens the door for industries to expand into corners they haven't touched yet. And, as business grows bigger, it provides more opportunities for humans. Obviously, we live in a managerial class era right now. So I think, as industries expand, there's more opportunity for people to now fill these roles in just in different areas. So instead of putting a fender on a car or whatever it is, you're now charged with an oversight role or an administrational role. And I think there's growth, there's room for those types of jobs as these industries come back to America, and they continue to grow. AI pushes them, like I said, into new heights, and we see continue to see breakthrough after breakthrough in industry, and these formerly maybe mediocre, some of them mediocre industries or mid-sized industries just grow into absolute behemoths, as we continue to push the boundary of what's possible for human civilization. And I think that's what AI does, is that it allows us to kind of, at least right now, put one foot on the other side of that line and kind of experience what that's like. And I think eventually we'll bring the other foot over too. Um, but yeah, sorry, what was your last question there, Sam?
Yeah, just
What's
and
informing
I
that
think you've
perspective?
kind of answered it already. It was what's really leading you to believe that tariffs like these will allow us to bring back jobs for workers in the manufacturing sector. What's because it seems like the way this conversation was set up, there's kind of two paths that it's highly automated, or it really brings back like the Rust Belt and so forth. Though I think you've added some nuance here, Connor, that really the main point, and correct me if I'm wrong in interpreting your perspective here, the main point is just bringing manufacturing back to the United States in a lot of these crucial sectors. And the idea is that tariffs can accomplish this, and that once we have manufacturing back, even if a lot of it is automated, the existence of AI and innovation would allow us to branch out the jobs available in the manufacturing sector domestically here in the United States. That you have faith in that sort of process, and that's how we would allow jobs to be brought back in that sector in the United States without, say, maybe just a fantastical return to a bygone era of manufacturing. Is that what you're
Right.
saying?
Yeah, and another important point to bring up is that, okay, it's going to cost more to buy that same truck in America than it is to buy a Chinese truck or whatever it is. But tariffs level the playing field here, and I think there's enough variety in domestic manufacturing. There we have so many different. I can't even name all the different car companies that America produces. We have a lot of them, and competition is what the free market thrives on. Now, yes, we do have to pay our workers a lot more, and that's going to be reflected in the sticker price of a car. It is gonna cost more, um, but and that's something that this is, I think, kind of a sticking point for a lot of people who are in favor of, the like an interconnected global economy is, um, how are we going to export these products? If we say, okay, well, we protected our industries, and here's our all made in America truck, and now we want to export it to other countries, because that's the entire point of bringing manufacturing back to the U.S. is, well, one, you want to sell it to Americans, but also ideally you want to sell it on the global market, and that helps create more jobs the more the business grows. But that depends on how much you can sell, and so if we want to sell these products overseas, we're gonna have to hope that there's no reciprocal tariffs in place, which it seems like it's already happening, right? Countries are retaliating with tariffs of their own, and that makes it more difficult for American manufacturers to export things abroad, and that's a whole other can of worms. But I think that, uh, yeah, this kind of points to what Eric was saying earlier, is that perhaps this is just a negotiation strategy to some degree, and maybe the tariffs do remain in place, but they're not these insane, crazy tariffs. Uh, yeah, we'll see. It's you can never tell with Trump, really, until it happens.
Yeah. 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 So Eric, let's return to you here for a moment. Um, I do have a particular question. Um, if you want to address anything else Connor said, please feel free to. But I remember we talked about this point of education, and how it might allow us to really adapt to a more automated and technologically advanced manufacturing center if we invest in, as you said, this sort of hyper education. That when we talk about bringing jobs back to the United States in manufacturing, it needs to be supplemented with a sort of education to allow for maybe those more administrative roles, oversight roles, maybe more skilled roles, things like that. Um, but Connor made the point earlier that the United States, has had lots of college education, and it hasn't really helped us here. And I saw you laugh when he made that point there. So I don't know if there's something that you want to note there. If maybe your idea is that, oh, the United States has invested in a lot of education, but maybe it's not the right education, or something like that. Like, if you just want to talk about that more, what hypereducation looks like, and whether that might blend with what Connor was saying earlier about how AI and the return of manufacturing in the US in our technologically advanced economy might allow for those more administrative or oversight roles, and the expansion of what it means to be employed in the manufacturing sector. So if you just want to address that, that would be fantastic.
Sure. So yeah, I did chuckle. And the reason for that is, while we are the most educated society, we spend more per capita on education. I think we're in the top 10. We've never been less proficient at basic math and reading skills. We can really see this with our young people. So what I'm really talking about, and this is a little self-owned, I guess, if you will. No more liberal arts funding. Okay, we don't need to be paying for our students to learn gender studies. And I think that's something that happens at the federal level, the Department of Education. So all for taking that apart. But I also think down to the lowest level, we need to rethink how we do education. The current education model is based off the Prussian model from, I believe, early 1900s, late 19th century. I think we need to totally rethink that. We need to refocus on STEM. Obviously, history is important, and liberal arts educations can be important. But if the government is going to fund any type of education, it needs to be along the lines of STEM sciences, new AI things, coding along those lines. Although coding is becoming more obsolete as we sit here talking. Um, but yeah, I think it's just a rejiggering of the education system. If we're going to put money into the education system at the highest levels, I think it needs to be much more targeted. I think high school needs to be much more targeted. I went to public and private high school over the course of 4 years. And at public schooling, they would have a very small portion of the schoolers who were explicitly being trained for a trade. I think that's a great idea. And I think you could scale that up to a lot of different professions, a lot of things that we don't normally associate with the idea of a trade. Something like legal aspects. Although I guess that's more liberal arts. Automation, coding, engineering. You can start these children from a young age, whereas just teaching them a bland five subject matter that we've been teaching kids for 100 years. I think we can get more creative with that, and I think we need to get more specialized. That's what China's doing. I don't often take pages out of China's books, but they are specializing their kids, and their kids are really good at math. And I think that will help them, in the AI boom. You're just pulling from a larger, more intelligent class of young people. So yeah, I think, hyper education, not in the way that we currently speak about it, but in a totally different, kind of adjusted system for the future.
I would love to get more into a conversation on education, what that should look like. That might be a good idea for a future conversation, but we've, I appreciate your points there and clarifying that. I do want to, because we're running out of time here, I want to end off on maybe a more succinct question that might allow for you to kind of summarize some of the major points that you want anyone who's watching this to take away with. So we'll start with Connor here. Connor, what would you say to someone who looks at Trump's tariffs and kind of the overall tariff portfolio, is very, very worried, is really focused on the short-term costs of these tariffs, and doesn't see how these are going to bring, extensive benefits to Americans, return to manufacturing, maybe someone who's quite progressive and wants to kind of critique the Trump administration wherever possible. What would you say to someone like that who's looking at these tariffs, really doesn't see the benefit? How would you summarize your perspective? Here's why I support the tariffs.
I would say, just have faith in the process. Wait, and let's see what things look like after a couple of years, and after these tariffs are in place. This is definitely something that's a little daunting for a lot of people, and I totally understand that. I think there are a lot of valid concerns centered around tariffs and whether or not it's going to accrue more benefits than potential dangers or cons. But I was going to say, yeah, I think we've been taken advantage of for far too long, and also, this is a national security thing too. I think it is important that we produce our own semiconductor chips. That we produce, the majority of our own steel. We can't be dependent on China for these things, and we've outsourced a lot of this because, well, the market has deemed it, more efficient, which it was, for a time, but now as China's a rising power, the U.S. is a power that's in decline. Still the world's superpower, but we are in a period of decline. And as they're we begin to witness more and more geopolitical friction between China and the U.S. I think it becomes ever more important that we can produce cars inside of our own country, and all these other computers and this and that, just critical technologies, right, that we use in our military, that are just important for our everyday economy to run, because China could use these things like a light switch on us and say, oh, well, guess what, we produce X, Y, and Z that you guys need to survive, so we can just flip off this light switch, and we can basically kneecap you overnight, which is a massive worry. But as far as from like a consumer perspective, um, I don't know. I'm not sure. I think Trump is trying to also, devalue the dollar a little bit. I don't think that a strong dollar is necessarily in the interest, like a hyper strong dollar that we have right now, is necessarily in the interest of, the American layman. I think it primarily, I think it does benefit Americans when they go overseas, when they vacation, and our currency is stronger than all the rest of them. But that's not very often anymore because Americans are just so poor these days. Most of them can't even afford to travel abroad. Um, but we'll see if there's some sort of, if Trump introduces deflationary pressures, which also bring a host of problems with them, but could end up bringing some benefits as well. If the dollar starts to weaken a little bit, that's not necessarily a bad thing. And who knows, whether or not wages can keep up with the rise in the cost of living that's going to come with some of these tariffs, in combination, in tandem with maybe a weaker dollar. I don't know. I'm not an economist, but I do have faith in the process. I think I'm not saying that there aren't going to be hiccups and there aren't going to be hardships along the way. I think so, but ultimately, you know, I think it's better that some of these jobs are coming back, and even if it's, I don't know, maybe only 60% of the jobs in American manufacturing, as opposed to however many we had in the 1980s, then I think that's a good thing. So, and if it's just ends up being a negotiation tactic, then great. Maybe we can extract concessions that will level the playing field for us, because I don't think that continuing to run the alternative of all this, continuing to run a massive trade deficit into the future, I think is to the benefit of nobody except for, these coastal elites in places like San Francisco, Washington, D.C., and New York City.
All right. So, Eric, same question to you, but sort of the reverse. What would you say to someone who is in, you know, direct support of the Trump administration's tariffs, who absolutely loves them, who thinks they're going to create a massive boom for the United States? What points would you make to a person like that?
I would say first and foremost, are you willing to suffer for what it's worth? And Connor has mentioned this a few times. Um, and it's not exactly clear what's an American made product, when we talk about cars and whatnot, but there is no doubt there's a lot of businesses in the United States that operate with a steady stream of imports. So I think that would be an individualized question. Not everyone is going to be hit equally by these tariffs. It depends on where you work. It depends on what industry you're in. But aside from that, I would say I don't believe that Trump's tariffs will do what he's saying they will accomplish, because I don't believe he actually wants that. I think this is a negotiating tactic, and I think if these tariffs were ever to actually see the light of day, I think you would see a massive shrinkage of America on the world stage. I think we would go into a recession. Now, like, this is dangerous water we're getting into here because we're not economists, right? Um, but I think inflation would be on the table. This was what Republicans banged the table on for the last 4 years. I think we would see inflation, because prices would go up due to the tariffs. And I think it would be harder on the average American's pocketbook. So that's the generalized argument I would make. It kind of depends on what position you're in, because if you're working for an auto company, you might feel very differently about this. Like you're getting some protectionist agreements. But I think overall, if these tariffs see the light of day as is, I think we're going to see a massive shrinkage of the American economy. I think China could mobilize. And like Connor said, yeah, they're not apt to play into the hands of the Chinese. Japan doesn't like the Chinese. But at some point, money talks. This for the same reason the Europeans are buying Russian oil while also, steel manning how much they don't like them. Um, Japan, South Korea, these countries will cave for financial reasons. So I would make a point. The American economy is going to take a really hard hit, and because we're not protecting steel, aluminum, semiconductors, are we doing it for the right reasons? And the secondary point would be, we're ceding ground. Are you okay with America not being kind of the hegemonic, kind of empire structure that we've had, which could come with more wars? I know that's a whole different conversation, but those are the 2 points that I would make.
Mm. All right. Well, thank you so much for demonstrating your perspectives, for really walking me through why you think what you think, what's informing your views, and how they interact with opposing views here. So I really appreciate that. We're going to have to conclude the podcast here, and maybe we'll see you for a future episode. Thank you, everyone.
This podcast was brought to you by Our National Conversation, a place where students generate policy solutions to the biggest problems facing America. Join us in freeing political dialogue from hyperpartisanship. To learn more about what you heard today, check us out at ournationalconversation.org. You can also follow us on social media at Our National Conversation to show your support and keep up with our latest efforts.